Hi everyone, and thanks for joining me back. In this lesson, we will learn about the path created while animating the position parameter. I'm talking about this line here. For us to understand the path more clearly, let's delete all the keyframes except the last two to have a simpler animation. I will select the keyframes that are here in the middle and delete them by pressing the backspace key on the keyboard. So we are left with two keyframes. The first keyframe is here, and the second is here. Let's press the spacebar to see what the animation looks like. Excellent. Now I want to see only the position parameter in the layer. I don't need the scale parameter. We don't work with it now. So I will select the layer, press P once, then a second time. And now I only see the position. Now let's learn how to change the position of the dot. If I want the dot to start from here, and stop here. So first thing I have to stand with the time indicator on the keyframe which I want to change, then move the dot here. I'll press Ctrl Z, or I can stand on the keyframe again, and I can change the value from here. A nice thing to know about changing the values is that we can change the values with Shift. That way the change will be bigger. And if I want to change the parameter in small amounts, I'll hold Ctrl. And now I want the dot to get here. I can get to this keyframe using a very useful shortcut, the K key. That's how we move on to the next keyframe easily. And as before, I can either move the dot while holding the Shift key or change the position directly from the parameter value. Let's see what we got. Great! So now the dot is moving from side to side. And now, let's see what we can do with the path we have created. As you can see, this path has 2 points, which are actually our keyframes. Does it remind you of something? This is very similar to the path created when we create a line with the pen tool. I will call this layer stroke. I will change to another color so that we can distinguish between the layers. The path of the stroke also has these 2 points, which I can select and move wherever I want. So basically, we have some path on which we can add other points and change the shape of it. We can also make this point rounded using the Convert Vertex tool, or by holding the Alt key and clicking on a point. I can make both this point rounded and that one as well. So on this path, we can add points, delete points, and create rounded points. The path created from the position parameter behaves exactly like the path created with the pan tool. I will delete this layer and explain. If I go back to the selection tool, I can move the points of this path just like I moved the points of the path I created with the pen tool. And so I can change the animation of the layer. I will press Ctrl Z. It's just like I would change the animation in this way. I would go to this keyframe and then change the position of the layer to this place. Then I would go to the other keyframe and place the layer here. So instead of standing on the keyframe every time and then changing it, we can change our animation by moving the points of the path. In addition, just like we created rounded corners for the path of the stroke, I can also round the points in this path by pressing Ctrl-Alt and clicking. And here I can adjust the handle to create a rounded corner. I can do the same thing to this point. And that's how I can change the path of the dot animation. If I want to keep changing it, I'll stand somewhere in the middle, press Ctrl-Alt, and click at that point, and the same here. If in the middle of the animation, I move the dot to here, then I will have another point, another keyframe. I move the dot at this time of the animation as well. And now I have such an interesting path. And now I can convert those points to Bezier by holding Ctrl-Alt and then clicking. Then move the handles to create a more interesting path. Let's see what we got. What's cool about this is that we can move and change the position of these points without harding the animation. And if I want the whole animation to be faster, I remind you we need to select all the keyframes. Hold the Alt key and drag the last keyframe here. If I want it slower, then I'll move the last keyframe to here while holding the Alt key. Let's get the time indicator to seconds 3 and then move the keyframes here while holding Alt and Shift. I will also remind you about the shortcut K and J. If I want to change only one keyframe, then I can stand on it, and the most important thing to remember is to select only it, and not all keyframes, because if I select them all, the entire path will move. I'll press Ctrl-Z. If I want to change just that keyframe, then I'll select just that one, or just stand on it without selecting anything and then change the value to something else. If I want to change that keyframe, I can press J and then change its value. And if I want to move the entire animation, that is, the entire path, then we have to select all the keyframes, make sure to stand at one of them, and then move the whole thing. You can also move the entire path with the arrows on the keyboard. If I press Shift and arrows, then the movement will be in bigger jumps. Now I want us to delete the two keyframes in the middle. This keyframe, it's actually this point. I can delete it from here, and this one from here as well. Now let's adjust the path of this layer to the center. We will open the grid and place this point here. And this one here. I'll undo the rounded corners by holding the Ctrl-Alt and clicking on it. And now I'm back to the animation I had before. Now let's practice some more animation and add a cool scale animation to the dot. Let's get to this point in time to see the 2 points. I'll make sure I'm on the selection tool, and now I'll make these points rounded like we learned earlier, by Ctrl-Alt and clicking on it. I moved the handles in this way. And that's how I created a cool movement. Now let's add animation to the scale parameter, and create the illusion that the dot is moving toward us. To add another parameter to the layer, I will hold Shift and press S to open the scale parameter. Now I will return to the position and show you what would happen if we pressed only S without holding the Shift key. As you can see, I only see the scale parameter. This is not what I wanted. I wanted to see the scale together with the position parameter. Therefore, when we want to open an additional parameter to what is already opened, then we press Shift. I can also add the opacity, so I'll hold Shift and press T. It works the same if I want to hide one of the parameters. If I press Shift T again, then the opacity will disappear. Shift S will make the scale disappear. Shift S again, and the scale will reappear. So our dot is now a size 87. Let's change it to 100% to its original size. And now I'll tell the dot that from the second 0, your scale will be 100%. Here in the middle I want it to be, let's say, 370%. And in the end, you'll be back to being 100% like you were at the beginning. It looks like the dot is moving toward us, and then away again. In fact, we created a certain illusion. We can move the keyframes of the scale and see how it looks. That means we don't have to keep the keyframes of the different parameters next to each other. Play with it and see how it changes your animation. This will give you an understanding of the timings of the keyframes. We can go ahead and create another animation for the dot. For example, at this point, we can increase the size again and then return it to 100. Now I'll grab them all and move the last keyframe holding the Alt key. As you can see, the scale parameter has no path. A path is created only when we animate the position parameter. And now, let's see what happens if I delete the keyframes of the scale parameter. The size of the dot is 330. This happened because we deleted the keyframes when the time indicator was at the point in time when the dot's scale was 330. If I were to stand here, when the size of the dot is 100, and then delete the keyframes, then the dot will remain 100. This is a reminder of the importance of the order of deleting the keyframes. Now let's talk about the coolest thing in After Effects, with the help of which your animation will look professional. And this is called Easy Ease. Easy Ease is an action that makes the animation look much more interesting. Let's see how it works. But before that, let's hide the scale parameter because we won't use it. I'll press Shift-S. Now, let's align the keyframes of the position. I'll make sure I'm using the selection tool. Open the grid, and click on this point holding Ctrl and Alt to make the points unrounded. And now I want you to just listen and do nothing. And for those who haven't seen the first lesson in the course, go see it right away and get back to me. So this concept was also born in traditional animation. As you can see in the example, when I draw the balls at the same distances from each other, then the movement of the ball looks linear. And when I draw the ball at a different distance from each other, in the part where the balls are far from each other, the movement looks much faster. It means that we applied some ease to the movement of the ball animation. Now let's see how it works in digital animation, in After Effects. As we have already learned before, the drawings, that is, the in-betweens in After Effects, are presented by these points, which actually also represent the frames. So as you can see, the distances between them are exactly the same, so our animation looks like this. Linear. So how can we control the distance between these points? First, we need to change our keyframes from linear to Easy Ease keyframes. Let me duplicate the layer real quick, for the purpose of the example. The name of the new layer the automatically called .2. Now I'll change the color to blue. In order to remain the animation without ruining the keyframes, I will press U to show all the keyframes on the layer. I will select all the keyframes of this parameter. Make sure that I am standing on one of the keyframes with the time indicator, and then I will simply press the down arrow while holding the Shift key for the layer move in big jumps. And finally, I will tag the layer in purple color so that we can differentiate between the two layers. So now we have two dots with the same animation. And the duration of this animation is exactly 3 seconds. I will bring this layer down so that it is the same as the arrangement on the preview screen. And now I'll change this layer's keyframes to Easy Ease. I can do it in two ways. I can select them all, right-click, go to Keyframe Assistance, and choose Easy Ease. Or I can select all the keyframes and press the F9 key on the keyboard. For Mac users, hold the Fn key and press F9. And now if you notice that the distances between these points are different. Unlike what is on this layer. Here the distances change throughout the animation. Here the distances are the same, and here there is a little more space between them. This distance determines the visibility of the dot's movement. To understand it more clearly, I want to exaggerate the spacing between these points. I will do it with the help of the graph editor. So I'll select the two keyframes, go into the graph editor, and make sure I'm on the speed graph. The graph size will be adjusted according to the size of the panel. Here I can zoom in and zoom out. And now I will explain what we see here. I am talking about this layer now. So this point, this is the first keyframe, and this one is the second keyframe of this layer. In frame number 12, the speed of the dot is 472. At this point in the timeline, the speed of the dot is 860. And at the end of the animation, the speed here is nearly 400 again. If we get to the end of the animation, it looks like the speed here is 0. What we understand from this is that this graph is showing me the speed of the animation of the blue dot. I can increase the speed by moving these handles. I recommend moving the handles while holding the Shift key so that the point will not get out from the line here, and I also make sure that this icon is checked. Now let's understand what happened. This is very similar to what happens in traditional animation when I draw the dot far from each other. And as we learned in traditional animation, the farther the distance between the drawings is from each other, the faster the animation will look. The same here, the distances between the frames here are very far from each other, which will create a very fast movement. And on the other hand, the closer the frames are to each other, the slower the animation will look. Let's see how this is shown in the graph. Notice that when I am at this point in time, the speed is 100. Here it is 200. Here it is 448. But when I stand at this point in time, the speed jumps to 1070. This is the moment where the frames are far from each other. As I mentioned, it will create a fast movement. And now let's see the animation and compare between these two dots. I will exit the graph editor, reach here with the time indicator, and press N to bring the work area here, instead of bringing it manually in this way. I used the shortcut we learned, the N key. So now we will only see the 3 seconds of the timeline. Alright, let's see what we got. The animation of the two layers takes 3 seconds. But the blue dot has a much cooler movement. It starts slowly, picks up speed, and then slows down toward the end. What is important to understand that the animation's duration has not changed. That means the two dots arrive from the first keyframe to the last in 3 seconds each. I can make both dots do the animation for 2 seconds and it will look like this. The blue dot only creates the illusion that it is moving fast. I will press Ctrl Z. We can decide that the dot will start really fast in the beginning. Here I see that the speed will be really high, 2590, and towards the end, it will decrease. I see it here too. I see that there are far distances between these frames in the beginning, and at the end, I see the frames are crowded. This is what it looks like. It starts fast and then slows down. I can also do it the other way around, making the dots start slow and finish fast. Oh, if that happens, it's a good sign to do a purge. This is a good time to mention that when there are lags of this kind, we need to clean the unnecessary data. Okay, so the dot starts slow and then fast. I'll increase the work area for a bit so that we can see more of the animation and see it again. Now I want to teach you how to control the easy ease without entering and messing with the graph editor every time. But before that, I'll show you how to bring the keyframes back to normal easy ease. Before we played with the handles in the graph editor. All we need to do is select the keyframes and press F9 again. If I go into the graph, we can see that the keyframes are back to the same as before. And if I want to return the keyframes to linear, I will select them and click on them while holding the Control key. So I mention again, in order to make the animation more interesting, I had to select the keyframes. Press F9, then enter the graph and play with the handles. Then check that everything looks good. But there is a much faster way. I will bring the keyframes back to normal. So I do have to select the keyframes, press F9, and now instead of going to the graph editor, I will right-click on one of the keyframes and then enter the keyframes and velocity. Here I can control the easing of the animation instead of moving the handles in the graph. The percentages I see here represent the same percentages I see when I move the handles in the speed graph. So let's try to understand what these numbers mean for us, and see how it looks on the graph. It looks like a regular easy ease keyframe. Now I'll go back into the keyframe velocity, and this time I'll change the percentages to 85 and 85. Let's see how it's shown on the graph now. You see, it changed the curve of the graph as if I moved it through the handles manually, like we did earlier. So it's really convenient to control the easing of the keyframes without messing with the handles every time. Also, it's a much more accurate way to create a specific movement. To fully understand what happens when you change the numbers, you need to play with it, enter different numbers and see how it looks on the graph. Only after practicing will you understand what you are doing. Now I'll teach you a shortcut for this because it can be annoying to go into keyframe velocity through the right click all the time, especially when we have many layers with many keyframes. So the shortcut is very simple. After selecting the keyframes, simply double-click on one of them while holding down the Alt key. And now the window of the keyframe velocity opened up. So I can change the percentages here. I'll see the animation, and if I don't like it, I can go back to the keyframe velocity and change to something else. There is no right or wrong way. Sometimes it's more convenient to move the handles in the graph manually, and sometimes it's much handier to change the easing via the keyframe velocity panel. And now let's do it together on the black dot. I'll delete the blue one, and let's practice it together. So, first of all, I want the animation to be 2 seconds and not 3. I'll move this keyframe here. I will select all the keyframes from here. I will press F9. Then we will hold the Alt key and double-click on this keyframe. And now I will change the velocity to 85 and 85. Click OK and press the spacebar to see what we get. Excellent. And now I want to explain in which situations we should use keyframe velocity and not change the easing through the speed graph editor. But before that, let's change the final position of the dot real quick. Place the time indicator on the last keyframe and move the dot to the center of the composition. We can open the grid to see the center of the frame. So now I want to add a scale animation. So I will press Shift-S to add the scale parameter to my layer. I'll create a keyframe here. I'll also create the same keyframe here. And in the middle, I want it to grow to 400. And now, I want the easing of the scale animation to behave the same as the position animation. Basically, I want the scale to have the same easing. So I turn the keyframes to easy ease and then go into the graph editor and guess to get to the exact same curve as in the position graph. Or I can go into the keyframe velocity of these keyframes and write down the same percentages that I wrote down in the position. 85 and 85. And now I have the same easing for the scale and position animations. That's the end of the lesson, and I highly recommend you watch this lesson again from beginning to end, because here we learn the essence of the entire world of motion design. We learned what keyframes are, and learned to create cooler keyframes with the help of Easy Is. In the next lesson, we will continue to learn about the keyframes, and install another free script that will save us a lot of time working with them. But before that, I highly recommend taking a 10-minute break. Get up from your chair, do some light stretches, make some tea or coffee, and come back refreshed for the next part. See you in the next class.